Story 1. The Silent Stalker in the Forest, by Jack Whitmore. I've carried this story with me for over 2 decades, buried deep in the corners of my mind where the shadows linger. But now, I can't keep it hidden any longer. It's not just a memory anymore. It's a warning, because I know deep in my bones that it's still out there, waiting, watching. I grew up in a sleepy little town called Black Hollow, nestled in the heart of West Virginia, the kind of place where the mountains loom like ancient sentinels and the forest stretches endlessly, swallowing the horizon. Life there was simple, predictable, the kind of life where everyone knew your name, your family, and your business. But in the summer of 1998, everything changed. That summer, my best friend Travis and I landed jobs as trail guides for a small lodge on the edge of the Monongahela National Forest. It was easy work, lighting tourists through the scenic trails, pointing out the best fishing spots, and spinning tall tales about the local legends. Most of the trails were well-traveled and safe, but there was one we never took anyone to. The locals called it the Still Hollow Path. It wasn't on any map, but everyone in Black Hollow knew about it. The stories varied, but the core was always the same. People who ventured down that trail at night never came back. Some claimed to hear whispers in the trees. Others swore they saw something moving in the shadows, something that wasn't quite human. Travis and I, being 17 and invincible, thought it was all nonsense, just ghost stories to scare kids and tourists. But one night, after a few beers and a lot of bravado, we decided to hike it. Just a quick walk, we said. We'd prove the stories were nothing but bullshit. We set out around 10 p.m., armed with a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a cheap disposable camera. The trailhead was overgrown, barely visible beneath a tangle of vines and fallen branches. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. But as we ventured deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just silence. That's when we saw the footprints. They were fresh, pressed into the soft dirt of the trail, bare feet, too large to belong to a child, too small to be an adult's. Travis shone the flashlight on them, and we both froze. The prints were heading deeper into the woods, as if something had been walking ahead of us. "Maybe a hiker?" I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Travis shook his head. "Who the hell hikes barefoot out here?" Before I could respond, the smell hit us. Rotten meat, thick and cloying, like something long dead. My stomach churned, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought the batteries were dying. But then Travis aimed it ahead, and we saw it. A man, or something shaped like a man, standing about 20 feet away. He was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed stretched and twisted like a grotesque caricature of a human. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his bones. He was naked, his body unnaturally still, and his face was the worst part. He was smiling. Not a normal smile, but a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. His eyes were black pits, empty and lifeless, like a doll's, and he was staring right at us. Travis sucked in a sharp breath. "What the fuck?" The thing tilted its head, mimicking Travis's movement. Then it took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was learning how to walk. I don't remember who started running first. All I remember is the sound of our footsteps pounding against the dirt, the branches clawing at our faces, and the oppressive silence behind us. No footsteps, no breathing, just the feeling of being watched. When we finally burst out of the woods, we didn't stop until we reached my truck. We locked the doors, our hands shaking, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Travis turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear it?" I frowned. "Hear what?" He swallowed hard. It was mimicking our voices. I didn't believe him until I heard it myself. Somewhere out in the dark, just beyond the tree line, a voice whispered, "Did you hear it?" It was Travis's voice. We peeled out of there so fast I nearly crashed the truck. We never went back to that trail. Travis moved away the next year, and we don't talk much anymore. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still and the forest is silent, I hear something outside my window. A voice, my voice, whispering from the woods. And it's always smiling. Story 2. The Thing That Knocks at Midnight. Every summer in the small town of Black Hollow felt like a dream. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the nights were alive with the hum of cicadas and the flicker of fireflies. But beneath the idyllic surface there was a darkness that no one talked about, not openly at least. It was a darkness that came knocking. I grew up hearing the stories. My grandmother, a stern woman with a voice like gravel, would sit me down every summer and say, "Never answer the knock after midnight. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you don't answer." She'd lean in close, her eyes narrowing. It's not human. I didn't believe her, of course. Not at first. Kids in Black Hollow had been telling each other the same story for generations. They called it the Midnight Knocker. It was said that if you were outside after midnight, you might hear it. A soft, deliberate knock, knock, knock at your door or window. Some said it was a prankster. Others said it was something far worse. The summer I turned 16, I learned the truth. It was late July, and the heat was unbearable. My best friend Ellie and I had been sitting on her porch, trying to cool off. Ellie was the kind of person who laughed at everything, even the things that weren't funny. She didn't believe in the stories either. "It's just some old wives' tale," she said, tossing a pebble into the darkness. Probably started to keep kids from staying out too late. I nodded, but something about the way the shadows stretched across the yard made me uneasy. The trees seemed too still, the night too quiet. Then we heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a chill down my spine. The sound came from the side of the house where there was no door, just a solid wall. Ellie froze, her hand halfway to another pebble. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. "It's probably just a branch," she said, but her voice wavered. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was closer. The sound seemed to echo in the still night air, and the porch light flickered. I could see Ellie's face in the dim light, her usual bravado gone. "Let's go inside," I whispered. Ellie shook her head. "Number, if we go in, it wins." "Wins what?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Knock, knock, knock. The third time, it was right behind us. We turned, and for a split second, I saw it, a shape in the dark, too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, if it had eyes, were like black voids, and its mouth was stretched into a grin that made my stomach churn. I don't remember running, but I remember slamming Ellie's front door behind us, locking every bolt. Outside, the knocking continued. Knock, 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 right at the door. Ellie was pale, her hands trembling as she covered her ears. "It only knocks 3 times, she whispered. "If you don't answer, it leaves." We stayed awake until sunrise, huddled together on the couch. When we finally dared to check outside, the porch was empty, but carved into the wood of the front door were 3 deep marks. Knock, knock, knock. The next day, Ellie was different. She didn't laugh as much, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected to see something. I tried to convince myself it was just the shock, but deep down, I knew better. A week later, Ellie disappeared. Her parents found her bed empty, the window wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the dirt outside. But on the windowsill, carved into the wood, were 3 deep marks. Knock, knock, knock. The town held a search, but no one ever found Ellie. Some said she ran away. Others said she was taken by the midnight knocker. I didn't know what to believe, but I stopped staying out late after that. Years later, I returned to Black Hollow for my grandmother's funeral. The town hadn't changed much. The same quiet streets, the same whispering trees, but something felt different, like the darkness had grown thicker. On my last night in town, I stayed at my grandmother's old house. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album, when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. The sound came from the front door, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was just the wind, but the air was still. Knock, knock, knock. Closer this time, like it was moving around the house. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but it did nothing to ease my fear. Knock, knock, knock. Right behind me. I turned, and there it was. The same tall, thin shape I'd seen all those years ago. Its grin was wider now, its eyes darker. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. I don't remember running, but I remember slamming the door behind me, locking every bolt. Outside, the knocking continued. Knock, knock, knock. Right at the door, I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching my grandmother's old Bible. When I finally dared to check outside, the porch was empty, but carved into the wood of the front door were 3 deep marks. Knock, knock, knock. I left Black Hollow the next morning and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. Knock, knock, knock. And I wonder if it's followed me. Story 3. The Road That Calls Your Name. I used to love summer nights. The kind where the air feels like a warm blanket, and the cicadas hum so loud, it's like the earth itself is singing. But that was before the road, before the voice. Now I can't drive alone after dark. Not anymore. It was July of 2003. I was 19, working a job delivering auto parts in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The routes were simple, mostly highways, a few winding back roads. But there was one road I was warned about. If you ever see a road that wasn't there before, don't take it. That's what old Frank, my boss, told me on my first day. He said it with a straight face, like he was warning me about a pothole or a speed trap. I laughed it off. A road that wasn't there before sounded like some backwoods ghost story, the kind drunk uncles tell around campfires, until I saw it. It was past midnight. I had just dropped off my last delivery and was heading home. The main road was familiar, but then, up ahead, a road I'd never seen before. It was narrow, cracked, like no one had driven on it in years. But the street sign looked brand new, gleaming under my headlights. I slowed down, confused. I'd driven this way 100 times, and I knew for a fact there was no turn here. Then I heard it. Someone calling my name. Not from behind, not from the side, from the road itself. It was a whisper at first, But as I stared down that dark path, it grew louder, clearer. My mother's voice. But my mother was miles away, asleep in her bed. The voice called again. "Come here, baby. You're going the wrong way." Something about it felt wrong. The tone was right, the softness, the warmth. But there was something beneath it, like a second voice hiding under hers. Something cold, something hungry. I slammed my foot on the gas. I didn't care where that road led. I wasn't going to find out. The next morning, I told Frank what happened. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. "You heard it, didn't you?" I asked him who or what was calling me. He wouldn't say, just told me that road only appears for certain people, and if you turn onto it, you don't come back the same. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that road, heard that voice. And then a week later, it happened again. I was driving home after a late shift. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the asphalt. I was on edge, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. And then, there it was. The road, the same cracked pavement, the same gleaming sign, and the voice, louder this time. "Come here, baby. You're lost. Let me help you." I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but my truck didn't move. The engine roared, but the wheels just spun in place. The voice grew louder, more insistent. I could feel it in my chest, like a vibration. And then, I saw her. At the end of the road, standing under the streetlight, was my mother. She was wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to my high school graduation. She smiled at me, but her eyes were wrong. Too dark, too empty. "Come here, baby," she said, her voice sweet and sickly. "Don't you miss me?" I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the road was gone. My truck lurched forward, and I was back on the main road, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't tell Frank about the second time. I didn't tell anyone, but I started carrying a knife in my glove compartment, just in case. A few weeks later, I was driving home after a long day. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. I was almost home when I saw it again. The road. This time, it wasn't just my mother's voice. It was my father's, my best friend's, even my dog, who had died when I was 12. They all called to me, their voices overlapping, pleading, begging me to come closer. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But as I drove past, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. It was tall, too tall, with long, spindly limbs and a face that was just wrong. It didn't have eyes, just two dark holes that seemed to suck in the light. It smiled at me, and I swear I could hear it laughing. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I quit my job the next day, packed up my things, and moved to the city. I thought I could leave it behind, but I was wrong. It's been 20 years, and I still hear it. The voice, the road. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I'll see it out of the corner of my eye. A dark, narrow path, just waiting for me to turn onto it. And the voice, always the voice. "Come here, baby. You're going the wrong way." I don't know what's waiting for me on that road. But I know one day, I might not be strong enough to resist. One day I might answer, and I'm afraid of what will happen if I do. Story 4. The Campfire Eyes. I've always loved camping. The smell of pine needles underfoot, the way firelight dances on your friends' faces, the way the woods go so quiet at night. It feels like the whole world is holding its breath. But that all changed in the summer of 2011. deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota. That's when I learned that the dark doesn't just hide things. It watches, and some things don't blink. We were 4 dumb college kids, me, Danny, Tyler, James, and Mark, on a weekend trip, the kind where you pack more beer than food and tell yourself you're getting back to nature. We'd hiked about 5 miles into the hills, far enough that the only sounds were the wind and our own stupid laughter. By the time we set up camp, the sun had long since dipped behind the pines, leaving the sky a bruised purple. We built a fire, passed around a flask of cheap whiskey, and started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, urban legends about hook-handed killers and vanishing hitchhikers. Mark, always the joker, was in the middle of some half-assed tale about a skinwalker when he suddenly stopped talking. His mouth hung open, his eyes locked on something behind me. "Someone's out there," he whispered. I rolled my eyes. "Nice try, man. We're not falling for—" Then I saw his face. No smirk, no twinkle in his eye, just raw animal fear. We all turned, and that's when we saw them, 2 eyes, not glowing like an animal's, not reflecting the firelight, just black. Solid black, like holes punched in the night. And they didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. James grabbed his flashlight and swung the beam toward the trees. The second the light hit them, the eyes vanished. Not like they closed or darted away, more like they'd never been there at all. Mark let out a shaky breath. "What the hell was that?" Tyler laughed. But it was the kind of laugh you force when your gut is screaming run. Probably just a deer or something. Then we heard it. Breathing. Not the slow, steady rhythm of an animal. This was ragged, wet, like something with ruined lungs. And it was close, right behind us, just outside the firelight. James whipped the flashlight around. Nothing, just trees and shadows. The breathing stopped. Tyler stood up, his voice tight. "Let's just get in the tents." Nobody argued. We zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags like little kids hiding from monsters. But none of us slept. Because all night, we heard it. Something moving around the camp. Not footsteps, not the rustle of leaves, just that breathing, circling us, sometimes so close, I could swear I felt hot, rancid air seeping through the tent fabric. At dawn, we packed up in silence. No jokes, no stupid stories, just quick, fumbling hands stuffing gear into backpacks. As we hiked back to the car, none of us looked back. Except me. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to prove to myself it had all been in my head, but when I turned, I saw them again, the same black eyes. Only this time they weren't deep in the trees. They were at the edge of the clearing, watching, and they were closer. We never went back to those woods. Tyler moved out west a year later. James joined the military, and Mark won't talk about it at all. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think about those eyes, and I wonder, if we'd stayed another night, would they have been even closer? And what would have happened if they'd finally reached the fire?